Welcome back to the Ancestral Findings podcast. The wind had turned sharp over the fields of County Clare. It carried the sour smell of rot, the smell of potatoes dying in the ground. Every family in Kilfenora knew that scent by now. It had haunted them for 2 years, and it had come back again, crueler than before. Sean O'Callaghan knelt in the furrows, turning one blackened plant after another. The stalks came apart like wet paper. There was no good food left, only the gray mush that told him the blight had found them again. His wife, Brigid, stood at the edge of the field, shawl pulled tight, the wind lifting the edges. She didn't need to ask what he'd found. Behind her, the cottage leaned in the rain. Their children watched from the doorway. Maeve, 17, sharp-eyed and restless, and her little brother Declan, who hadn't known a full belly in a year. Sean said quietly, "We'll not live through another winter here." Brigid looked toward the sea. "Then we must go where there is bread." They tried to stay. They boiled weeds, gathered nettles, chewed bark. Brigid traded her last linen cloth for a handful of oats. In February of 1847, the landlord's agent came on horseback, ledger in hand. He did not dismount. "The rent's 6 months due," he said. Sean stared at the mud at the man's boots. "The land gave nothing. We'll pay when it does." The agent closed the ledger. "The estate can't wait on God." Within a week, their cottage roof was pulled down, and the family was turned out. They took shelter in a neighbor's barn, but by spring the barns were crowded with others like them. Fever spread. Declan coughed through the nights, his breath rattling thinly. At the relief station, Brigid stood in line for a ladle of soup. The priest spoke softly of ships leaving Limerick, ships bound for America, where the soil was rich and the wages steady. The fare was cruelly high, but the local committee offered assistance for those willing to leave. Sean resisted. "My father's buried here," he said. "So will Declan be if we stay," Brigid answered. He said nothing after that. They sold what little they had. Brigid's wedding brooch, Sean's tools. A cousin in Ennis had gone before them and sent a letter with half the fare enclosed. Brigid carried it in her bodice, creased and stained, the paper soft as cloth. Maeve tried to imagine America. She had heard of streets lined with lamps and shop windows filled with bread. She had also heard of ships so crowded that people slept standing. At night she whispered prayers for courage. On a cold morning in April, they walked the road to Limerick, carrying a single trunk. The hedges were bare, the fields gray with rain. Along the road they passed other families, gaunt men, women with babies, children with hollow eyes, all walking toward the sea. The port smelled of tar and smoke. The ship waiting at the quay was called the Caroline, a 3-masted bark bound for New York. It looked impossibly large to Brigid, but when they boarded, the hold seemed no bigger than a cellar. Rows of bunks stacked like shelves. A doctor inspected them for fever, nodding them through with weary indifference. The first days at sea were calm. The passengers sang at night, their voices thin against the wind, but as they lost sight of land, the waves grew higher, and the air fouler. Seasickness swept the decks. Buckets overflowed. Brigid held Declan as he shivered. Sean tried to trade his bread ration for water, but there was none to spare. In her bunk, Maeve wrote a few lines in a small notebook she had carried from home. "If God means for us to live, He will show us another shore." By the 3rd week, fever broke out. A boy from Cork died one night and was buried at dawn, sewn into his blanket, the sound of the splash swallowed by the sea. Brigid crossed herself and whispered prayers for his mother. Sean grew weaker. He'd been coughing for days, but he refused to lie down. "If I rest, I'll not rise again," he said. The ship's doctor, overwhelmed and half-starved himself, did what he could with vinegar and salt water. The smell of sickness filled the hold. Maeve cared for her father as best she could. When his fever eased, he looked at her and said, "You'll remember this, girl. You'll tell it one day." "I will," she promised. At last, after 6 long weeks at sea, a shout rose from the deck. "Land! Land ahead!" The passengers surged upward. Through the morning mist, they saw it. A low line of green and gray. America. They disembarked at Castle Garden in New York. thin as shadows. Officials recorded their names with hurried pen strokes. O'Callahan became Callahan. Brigid didn't correct them. They followed a crowd of countrymen to 5 Points, the Irish quarter near the docks. The streets were narrow and loud, filled with carts, pigs, and shouting. The air smelled of smoke and whiskey. Sean found work unloading ships. Brigid took washing. At night, Maeve stared from their tiny room at the brick walls across the alley. The sounds of fiddles and laughter drifted up from below. It wasn't Ireland, but it was alive. They joined St. Peter's Parish, where the priest spoke with their same Clare accent. On Sundays, the church was full of families who had come over on ships just like the Caroline. They prayed for those left behind and for the dead buried at sea. Declan's health improved. He played in the street with other boys, his cheeks no longer hollow. Brigid began to keep a small jar for savings, pennies and nickels toward rent on a better room. One evening, as she scrubbed linen, she found Maeve staring out the window again. "What do you see, love?" she asked. "Nothing. Everything," Maeve said softly. "I think of Dawsfield. I think of the sea. I think we made it across the world." Years passed. Sean's back stiffened from labor, but he never returned to Ireland. "My bones will rest here," he said. "We've buried enough across the sea." Maeve became a seamstress. In time, she married a stonemason from Limerick. They moved uptown to a cleaner street. She kept her father's old spade, carried all the way from Clare, as a reminder of what had been lost and what had been built again. In 1870, when the census taker came, she wrote her birthplace as Ireland and her son's as New York. For the first time, the line between old world and new was clear. On quiet nights, she told her children stories of the journey, the hunger, the ship, the first sight of land. "We are from Ireland," she would say, "but America is where we grew strong." By the time Brigid and Sean were gone, the O'Callahan name had spread across the city. Their descendants became teachers, policemen, nurses. Each generation knew the tale of the voyage, though the details softened with time. What remained was the truth beneath it, the courage to leave, the will to endure, and the faith to begin again. Maeve lived to see electric lamps and paved streets, but she never forgot the smell of wet earth in Clare or the blackened fields that sent them on their way. When she was old, she wrote one last line in that same small notebook she had carried on the Caroline. "We were hungry once, but hope fed us across the sea." Today, somewhere in America, a descendant of the O'Callahans may still wonder where the family began. They might open a genealogy record, see the name Callahan, and not know it started in a cottage beside a dead field in County Clare. But the story endures. It lives in faith, in work, in the simple act of remembering. That is the journey from Ireland. If you've got a hard-to-find ancestor you're stuck on, I'd love to hear about it. Just head over to ancestralfindings.com and click on Contact to send me a message. While you're there, take advantage of our free weekly genealogy lookups, explore thousands of articles, and enjoy hundreds of podcast episodes. We've been helping family history researchers since 1995. And if you're looking for even more, check out our Genealogy Gold Q&A series over on Patreon. Thanks for listening, and as always, happy searching.